I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker and my co-organizer, Dr. Tetiana Shevchenko. She is a senior researcher at the University of Lausanne. Also, she head of the Crimean department, the Ukrainian Association of Archaeologists, head of the publishing department and at the Institute of Archaeology of the National Academy of Ukraine. And she also author of 2 monographs and more than 60 articles. So her speech is Occupied Archaeological Heritage in Crimea. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation of my modest person. So let's start this conference with the consequences of occupation politics for the archaeological heritage of the Crimea. And I will start with the sentence that the Crimea, as well as the whole territory of Ukraine, is rich for archaeological sites, which are a part of cultural heritage. Numerous hill forts, settlements, necropolis, hoards, and artifacts have been under the Russian occupation since 2014. And according to the international law, the country occupied doesn't have a right to use and benefit from the archaeological heritage. However, in reality, the excavations at the Crimea not only have not been stopped or minimized, but have been increased in several times. At the beginning, the Russian scholars tried to justify their active archaeological activity by assuring that only rescue excavations are being provided. For this reason, they had to widen the term rescue, adding to it the risks and damages of natural animals and potential damages. For example, most of the classical sites are situated by the seashore, as we know, so their earth excavations can be explained by the water erosion danger. But it is widely known that far from all ancient Greek sites are being excavated, especially at one time. Unlike the beginning of occupation, currently the topic rescue works as the only choice is forgotten. And the Russian colleagues openly proud of the large scale of the excavations in the Crimea, both in the scientific publications and in their appearance at mass media. Their activity at the vicinity of Chersonissos, which you can see now on the screen, included into the heritage list of UNESCO, they call the largest excavations in the world. The most painful in this situation is the fact that archaeological heritage is non-renewable. The excavations is the ruining, damaging, destroying method of research, and it is never associated with haste. We can never hurry up, as the main information from the site can be collected only at the moment of excavations. Everything missed is lost forever. As a student, I took part in the excavation, the international expedition in the Crimea. And I was surprised when the work of the whole team was stopped because we were waiting for a specialist in ancient ironmongery, whom one of our chiefs invited from another country. And I understood only when she came and started her work. She collected metal shavings on a magnet wrapped into the white cloth, and that became an extra proof that for a blacksmith's activity. And this is how the site was excavated. What we can see now is extensive construction of military objects and military infrastructure all around the peninsula, and archaeological excavations which are conducted at the places of construction in a single season, which means that their main goal is not to protect and not to research, but to collect the finds. Despite the replacement of concepts, there are no doubt in the goal of hasty excavations. They rush to take away everything they can while the territory is illegally theirs. I wanted to give you some numbers. Every year, the Russian bodies give dozens of excavation licenses to their own institutes. And for instance, the State Hermitage received 6 licenses for excavations only in the Crimea in 2022. In the previous year, it received 10 licenses. The Institute of Archaeology of Russian Academy of Sciences, 5 licenses. Other expeditions providing excavations were the Institute of Material Culture of the Academy of Sciences, 2 universities from Moscow, and 1 from Tula. The independent research activity of the scholars who stayed in the Crimea shortened, and now they write in their publications that they are happy to participate, and in some cases to lead the groups within the archaeological projects headed by their colleagues from Moscow and St. Petersburg, from Voronezh, Krasnodar, and Tula. While we may calm ourselves down with the idea that the Crimean sites are in the reliable hands of Russian and Crimean scholars, as Russian scholars were widely invited for cooperations before 2014, and we regularly met at the conferences, at the projects, and even these hopes are not quite true, because the sin is that Russia gives excavation licenses to private organizations as well. And their number is higher than the permits given to academic and scientific institutions. For example, the organization called the Crimean Regional Center for Archaeological Research received 19 permits, 19 licenses. Nobody saw the reports of their excavations, neither in local publications nor in the conferences, and this fact is stated in print. Moreover, most of participants of any kind of excavations at the Crimea after 2014 never had the experience of archaeological work in this region before. So I wanted to show you Chersonesus. This is a website of the museum in Kerch, and my colleagues know very well that Kerch is the site from which the objects are shown in many, many museums. So these are the ancient Greek collections, rich collections, but the site is full of Pushkin and World War II and everything else. So a strong reason for extensive research and restoration of certain sites is their usage in propaganda of colonization. Some sites, like for example of medieval city center in town of Stary Krim, which cannot serve for such reason, are just ruined without any ecological control. Since the occupation started, the new streets with new houses built by the newcomers from Russia appeared at the place of the medieval Caravanserai and close to it. And this territory was not studied by the archaeologists before the building, which is obligatory, actually. Furthermore, in the vicinity of this town, 2 military bases were built, and their territory were not only not shown to archaeologists, but it is not welcomed for any visitors in the known reasons. As for the archaeological sites useful for propaganda, as this museum on the territory of the ancient Greek site, they serve as base for colonization purposes, means for this propaganda. And Pantikapaeon in modern city of Kerch was proclaimed as the oldest city of the Russian Federation. It was a triumph in the Russian mass media and a shame in private talks with Russian colleagues, specialists, because as we know, between ancient Greek city and Russian state, there is a gap of several centuries. Chersonesus, as an easier related to the Russian history site, suffered more because it is claimed to be the clue site, because the prince of ancient Rus, Volodymyr the Great, is thought to be baptized there before he Christianized Kyiv. I will leave aside the imperial claims for the history of ancient Rus with the center in Kyiv whose name the state of Moscovia took in the 18th century and since then was called Russia. I will speak about the UNESCO site of Chersonesus, where the modern state in our days is having grand building projects in the shortest terms. The project is called Archaeological Park, which is going to spread for 23 hectares and include buildings of enormous size. You can see some small people over there behind our online participants, like on the basement of the columns. And these buildings include, for example, the branch of Pioneer Camp Artek, several museums and an underground parking for 800 cars. It seems to me that the idea of archaeological park was borrowed from the project developed together with application to UNESCO Heritage List. As a PhD student, I helped with some preparing of translations for this process, which included presentations to the local community, to the governing bodies, because it was a really long process, and time-consuming and source-consuming. Then the plans for archaeological park at the Hora were built, a park, not an underground building. The division at Chersonesus and Hora, which is a rural vicinity of the city, used to be one of the best preserved in the ancient Greek world. Therefore, it's really hard for me to know that this territory is being turned to a sort of Disneyland. There were only 2 archaeological seasons to conduct the research of this territory before burying the site under the huge buildings. More than 1 million finds are reported to be found there in such a short period. Recently, we've been surprised, and you can see some monks some priests and monks on the central picture, but I will show you some more. We've been surprised by the news that the monastery of the Russian Orthodox Church is going to be found at the site. Russian Church is the core in these changes of the site and its landscape. And the ground building process is being conducted on the commission of President Putin. He visited the site, delegated his confessor to spread the influence of the church. Moreover, the military institution participated in the buildings at the site. And what's important to say, it is only after the occupation it will be possible to know the true history and reasons for rapid changes of the directors of many museum institutions after 2014. And their choice by the rulers don't seem to be based on academic or administrative skills of the candidates. The most vivid case for me was again in Chersonesus, when the representative of Russian Church, in fact, the Orthodox priest, was put as a director of the Chersonesus Museum. It led to the position of the scientific employees. It ended by normal things, but the church orientation of the museum's activity was later led by the next directors. The propaganda at the museums combines with propaganda at schools. 10 years is the term when kids start and graduate from school, receiving the full pack of information needed for a Russian citizen living at a colonized periphery. Yes, you can see some nice pictures from the websites. As for archaeological finds, at some stage, the researchers stopped, the Russian researchers stopped announcing that they leave everything to the local museums. For the Ukrainians who lived in the Soviet Union for decades, the practice of treating the valuable archaeological finds is well known. They are taken for proper study, for proper restorations, for contemporary exhibitions in Moscow and Petersburg, and never come back. Recently, the prosecutor's office of the Crimea in exile renewed the criminal cases so that the statute of limitations wouldn't expire. And those cases concern the illegal excavations at the Crimea, the transfer of artifacts, monuments, antiquities to the territory of Russia. Wide-scale appropriation of cultural values prohibited by the second protocol of the Hague Convention is faced, and the sanctions introduced, we hope, will stop the excavators from presenting their research to the international community and legitimizing in this way the activity in the Crimea, the archaeological activity, I mean. Actually, Russia failed to achieve the legitimization of its occupation directly, but it uses various alternative ways to do it, despite the fact that all European countries follow the concept that international law cannot be violated. We can see that occupation and legitimization of the occupied territories as factual territories of Russia is recorded. The handbooks on history, geography, record these concepts in the heads of young people. Similar evidence can be found, similar to this one, can be found not only in Switzerland, in other countries like Germany and Austria. And of course, the fact of occupation shouldn't be accepted even after 10 years. It is important to informatively support the awareness of this. And heritage, especially archaeological heritage, cannot be a device in the imperial claims, as it is an evidence of distant history of various peoples. It needs to be protected, but not used selectively or destroyed selectively. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I'm happy to introduce you our next speaker, Elmira Ablyalimova-Chyihoz. And at first, I want to apologize for not writing her full name in the conference poster. I'm so sorry about this. She is an expert in culture studies. She was in charge of one of the Crimea's largest historical and cultural institution, Bakhchysarai Historical and Culture Museum. Now she is a project manager of Crimea Institute of Strategic Studies. These organizations focuses on the protection of the cultural heritage during the current war, particularly on the issue of monitoring the state of the cultural heritage objects on the occupied territory of the Crimea. And her speech, Cultural Erasure in Crimea, Why Monuments Were Destroyed.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I'd like to add something about our organization. Crimean Institute for Strategic Studies. It is a non-government organization that focused on the issue of Crimean cultural heritage before February 2022. After full-scale invasion of our organization expanded our experience on the, unfortunately, other occupied by Russia territories of Ukraine. Now we are trying to monitor the cultural losses on the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk region. Honorable colleagues, it is an honor for me to be here with you today and have an opportunity to share information about our humble contribution in the sphere of cultural heritage protection. The purpose of my speech today is to focus on the present situation in Crimea in the context of the erasure of cultural identity. I'd like to show you encroachments on the identity of Crimean Tatars as an indigenous people of Ukraine to paint a wider picture of targeted discrimination. Unfortunately, I don't see my presentation. The next slide, please. I'm going to concentrate on three types of encroachments of the Russian occupying authorities on the Crimean Tatar cultural heritage, which build up into the larger policy of persecution of these indigenous people. In particular, I will talk about the demolition of the Crimean Tatar cemeteries and settlements that were found during the archaeological excavations from 2014 to 2022. Second, the destructive renovation of the Han Palace and other monuments related to Crimean Tatar history. And third, the renaming practices in occupied Crimea. The first years of Russia-Ukraine armed conflict from 2014 through 2023 were marked by massive unsanctioned archaeological excavation, as the previous speaker, Ms. Tetiana, mentioned above. For instance, in the period from 2014 to 2023, according to official information, the Russian authorities issued 900 permits for such activities. Part of them were conducted with the sole purpose of facilitating the construction of the Tavrida highway connecting the Kerch Bridge with Sevastopol, which is important in military strategic terms. The next slide, please. Another illustrative fact is that cultural sites which do not play a pivotal role for Kremlin and its political ideology are facing a high risk of damage and destruction. As an example of this statement, I will just give you a few numbers. Within the framework of construction of this highway that you can see in this slide, the occupied authorities have conducted more than 114 archaeological excavations, and only 3 of them were added to the category of museum objects. Please click twice on this presentation. And once more. There were 2 barrows of the Bosporan Kingdom, and the bridge, please click one on the presentation, yes, and the bridge that was built in honor of Empress Catherine II's visit to Crimea after it was annexed in 1783. That says it all. The other 111 archaeological sites were illegally excavated for demolition during the construction of the Kerch-Sevastopol highway. Among them, our team has identified more than 30 settlements and necropolises related with Crimean Tatar history. I'd like to show you 2 prime examples of this demolition. The next slide, please. The Koshkuyu first settlement is a historical Crimean Tatar village of the same name. Against a different background, it is distinguished by a long tradition of functioning and development horizons of the Mesolithic, Bronze, Early Iron Age, Antiquity, Golden Horde and Han periods, the Modern period and contemporary history. The existence of this settlement once again proves the continuity and succession of ancient cities and villages of Crimea throughout the life of the Homo sapiens on the peninsula from ancient to modern times. The Koshkuyu first settlement has several interrupted building horizons that you can see in the next slide. Please click on. The Crimean Tatar village of Koshkuyu is connected with a cemetery built at the same time. The settlement ceased to exist as a result of the deportation of the Crimean Tatar people in 1944. In 2015, and in the period from 2017 to 2018, the Koshkuyu first settlement was illegally excavated for demolition during the construction of the Russian Federation to Crimean Peninsula power grid bridge that was built in 2015 and the Kerch-Sevastopol highway that was built during the period of 2017 to 2018. Works with the usage of construction equipment were carried out on an area of approximately 3.1 hectares, which the site was completely destroyed. The next slide, please. The demolition of the Kirk Azizler cemetery is the second most illustrative example of discriminatory attacks on the cultural heritage of Crimean Tatars. Kirk Azizler translates from Crimean Tatars as 40 saints, which by itself manifests the significance of the place to Crimean Tatars. The particular cultural significance of the cemetery is connected with the complex of epitaphs of tombstones. Many of them contain the surname Kyrimy, which names Crimean or residents of Crimea. The majority of tombstones are from the 14th, 15th centuries. However, importantly, two of them date back to the 13th century and one to the 12th century. Thus, on a personal level, these tombstones record the long and unique history of Crimean Tatar people, as they record the deaths of the Crimean ancestry dating back centuries. And these are the people who self-identify as Crimeans and are exclusively connected with the lifeline of the peninsula. But beside that, on a sociological level, the tombstones clearly document the ethnogenesis of Crimean Tatars from the local population and their uninterrupted residence in the peninsula, which considerably predates both the Golden Horde invasion in 1239 and the mass settlement of the Russians and other Slavic ethnic groups in Crimea starting from 1783. Such evidence is unfavorable for Russia imperial, Soviet and current narrative on an exclusively Russian history of Crimea and renders it manifestly untrue. The Kirk Azizler cemetery was deliberately destroyed during the construction of Kerch-Sevastopol highway. To prepare an area for the large-scale infrastructure project, the occupying authorities of the Russian Federation ordered archaeological excavations, which were subsequently carried out in the period from 2016 to 2018. In 2018, archaeologists discovered a cemetery of the settlement of the late 13th, mid-late 14th century. In the course of construction, the occupation authorities excavated the centuries-old graves with backhoes and heavy machinery, destroying culturally significant layers of the site and leaving the bones of Crimean Tatar ancestors bare to the elements. In total, the occupation authorities destroyed more than 153 graves in area totaling more than 1 hectare, a crucial testament to the long history of Crimean Tatar culture on the peninsula, which predates the first major Russian settlement there. For comparison, please click the next slide. I'd like to remind you about the bridge built in honor of Catherine II's visit to Crimea after its annexation in 1783. The object dates back to the end of the 18th century. Due to the fact that the monument is the earliest evidence of the Russian colonial development of Crimea, it has been preserved and is open to visitors today. The second type of encroachment of the Russian occupying authorities on the Crimean Tatar cultural heritage is the destructive renovation of the Han Palace and other monuments related to Crimean Tatar history. Please, the next slide. Of course, the most illustrative example is Bakhchysarai Han Palace. I'm not going to waste time mentioning the well-known restoration rule and principles that have been grossly violated by the Russian occupying authorities. I am sure you are aware that, as a result of Russia's activities, the Han Palace in Bakhchysarai has reached tragic proportions and the complex is being stripped of its authenticity and turned into a shaddily renovated new build. It has been losing its scientific and historic values. I'd like to add some important things. The factor of the authenticity is of fundamental importance in many ways. An ancient building replaced by a new copy loses its values as a historical witness of the past, retaining only the value of visual illustration. It no longer exists as a monument of material culture. I would like to say that even the visual function which is illegibly preserved by Russia shows this monument from the point of view of Russia, the country that took away our statehood, and that during all this time, from 1783 to even now, has been seeking to destroy our identity, to assimilate and to erase even the memory about Crimean Tatar people. But it is not the only such case. The next slide, please. The second case is the archaeological site Akhmedjit Palace of Kalga Sultan and cultural layers of ancient city of Akhmedjit. At the end of the 15th century, Khan Mingli I, the great institutionalizer of the Crimean Khanate, founded the post of Kalga Sultan, the commander of the army of the Crimean Khanate, the first heir to the Khan's throne. The lands of the Kalga Sultan included the territory of the modern Simferopol, the administrative center of Autonomous Republic of Crimea now in current situation. Those Crimean Tatar name is Akhmedjit. A palace for the Kalga Sultan was built there. The archaeological site Akhmedjit Palace of Kalga Sultan and cultural layers of ancient city of Akhmedjit also includes the archaeological layers of the 1502 Kibir Jami Mosque complex and the archaeologized urban buildings of the old city of the late 15th to early 20th centuries. After the annexation of Crimea in 1783, Akhmedjit, the modern Simferopol, also lost its main architectural and political role. The palace of Kalga Sultan, Akhmedjit, named Bakhchysarai, fell into disrepair at the end of the 18th century when Russian troops were stationed there. It is necessary to understand that the historical part of Akhmedjit didn't perish. It was simply renamed by the Russian first to Simferopol and then separated within the old town district. At the same time, the colonizer, without any doubt, still believed that the history of Akhmedjit Simferopol is a little over 200 years old, and that before them it was nothing but a scorched desert. The next slide, please. One can hardly invent a more complete and vivid metaphor for the modern fate and state of Crimea than the story of Bakhchysarai. At present, the location of Kalga Sultan's palace is called the Dogs Creek, and it's partly used as a natural landfill. In the formerly famous garden of Bakhchysarai, a church of the Russian Orthodox Church is being built illegally, even from the point of view of the occupation laws. The Russian colonial policy, wherever it takes place, always uses three basic principles: oblivion, denying the obvious, and marginalization. The main problem is the direct ignoring of the historical and cultural layers of the Crimean Khanate era by the occupation authorities. Instead of strengthening the activities related to the protection and preservation of archaeological sites in the old part of Akhmedjit, modern Simferopol, the occupation authorities open a new niche for making profit from expertise and illegal archaeological excavation for demolition, which began in the city as early as 2019. Why have I made such conclusion? The next slide, please. This territory is private territory now. The next slide. In this slide, you can see a screenshot from Crimean media saying that the developer organized and paid for archaeological excavations. And archaeologists who got money for excavation have found nothing. So the developer can continue the construction. Another act of the occupying authorities that aims to dilute the essences of the cultural identity of Crimean Tatar indigenous people is renaming archaeological sites with an intention to erase the pre-Russian history of the peninsula. The next slide, please. The renaming games didn't start with the occupation, but were practiced by the Soviet Union in the middle of the 20th century, after the deportation of Crimean Tatar people from Crimea. The town of Aisiris, whose name means moonlight in Crimean Tatar, was renamed to Междуречье, literally between the rivers, in 1945. The Russified name was chosen in tandem with an ongoing attempt to explain the origin of Crimean toponyms with the similarly sounding Greek words, Eichos, Saint Sergei. Saint Sergei, Sergei Radonежский, was the saint wonder worker in the Orthodox tradition. He lived in the 14th century and was born near Rostov and never visited Crimea. An attempt to link the name of a Crimean Tatar town with the canons of the Orthodox tradition was an obvious attempt to deny not only the fact that Crimean Tatars inhabited the territory of Aisiris, but also that they are an indigenous people of Crimea. After the occupation of Crimea in 2014, a significant number of sites were named without any regard to their Crimean Tatar history. The Mount Group Nizhnya Djardjava was named by Russian archaeologists after an abandoned industrial zone, the cement suburb on the southern outskirts of Kerch. Settlement of Ayip Ili, northwest too, was discovered in 2016 during archaeological survey carried out during the preparation for the construction of Kerch-Sevastopol highway. Instead of sticking to the Crimean Tatar name on the nearby village named Ayip Ili, the settlement was named Lugavoye, literally meadow, which was the Stalin's or Soviet-era names for Ayip Ili. Many more objects were named in a way that distinguished and disguised the connection of the archaeological and historical site with the Crimean Tatar people. New names are devoid of specific reference to their historical affiliation. Their usage is aimed solely at erasing the memory of the indigenous people of the peninsula from the historical landscape of Crimea and expelling the historical cultural association of Crimean Tatar with Crimea. Russia's mistreatment of Crimean Tatar cultural heritage, including through the said demolition of the ancient Crimean Tatar cemeteries, the destructive renovation of the last remaining Han's palace that erases its historical and cultural features, and new imperial replacement of Crimean Tatar toponyms that has a much deeper and more lasting corrosive effect than the initial intention to suppress political dissatisfaction with the occupation. Such discriminatory practices undermine the long-lived historical connection of the indigenous people with the peninsula, devalue the relevance of its culture, and gradually change the identity of Crimean Tatars and cultural identity of the peninsula. Thank you very much. And if you don't mind, click the next slide, please. Using this QR code, you can find all information about our organization, Crimean Institute for Strategic Studies, and our site. And if you want to find a lot of information about different violations related with cultural losses that we identify on the territory of Crimea and the territory of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk region. You can click on our site and find this information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speakers are from Kyiv University, named after Borys Grinchenko, Professor Olena Aleksandrova, Dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities in this university, and Professor Galyna Sagan, and their speech is Immigration of the Crimean Tatars to Turkey after the occupation of Crimea in 2014, New Challenges.
Dear colleagues, for both the former Russian Empire and the present-day Russian Federation, the idea of annexing Crimea has simultaneously entailed the liberation of its land from Tatar population. At the time of Crimea's initial annexation by Russia in 1783, Crimean Tatars constituted 98% of the peninsula's population. Empress Katerina II broached the subject of finding a means to rid Crimea of its Crimean Tatars inhabitants of Islamic faith, and to repopulate the territory with other Christian people. Later, Emperor Alexander I also raised this issue. However, due to the lack of railway infrastructure at the time, mass deportation was impossible. During the Crimea War, Emperor Alexander II revisited this matter. Once again, mass deportation was not realizable, but efforts were made to deport individuals and facilitate the immigration of Crimean Tatars to the Ottoman Empire. The next slide, please. Yes, this is Turkey and Crimea, and this is the map of our Ukraine, and you can show the next slide, please. The deportation of Crimean Tatars during the Second World War was not a spontaneous or unpleasant event. It was premeditated and intentional. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars left Crimea and settled in the territory of modern-day Turkey. This was not immigration in its contemporary voluntary sense. Rather, it occurred under pressure and threats as an attempt to escape repression by the Soviet authorities, who accused all Crimean Tatars of collaboration with German fascists. The next slide, please. Currently, a new wave of deportation of Crimean Tatars from their homeland is taking place. This process commenced following the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. The present-day deportation exhibits a passive character, being non-massive in nature, yet resulting in the departure of many Crimean Tatars from the peninsula. As of December 2021, approximately 64,000 individuals have left the territory of occupied Crimea. The majority of these individuals are Crimean Tatars. The next slide, please. Crimean Tatars who do not remain silent and protest against the regime are either forced to leave the peninsula or become victims of undisclosed, even uninvestigated murders of political prisoners. Everything is done to intimidate and silence them. Ordinary Crimean Tatars are compelled to live in search of employment opportunities and access to education for their children. By prohibiting Crimean Tatar media, schools, religion, culture, language, and identity, everything is done to assimilate them with Russians. The next slide, please. According to the Commissioner of the Верховна Rada of Human Rights, Lyudmila Denisova, in May 2021, Russia was persecuting 93 Crimean Tatars for political reasons. Of these, 78 were then undergoing illegal punishment on the territory of the Russian Federation. Since the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, the Crimean Tatar diaspora in Turkey has been actively assisting their compatriots in Ukraine. Here, funds are collected for the families of political prisoners, humanitarian aid is provided, rallies are held outside the Russian embassy, and information, even reception in Crimea, is disseminated. These activities are mainly undertaken by people united in Dernex, Societies for the Culture and Mutual Assistance of Crimean Tatars. There are both 50 such organizations in Turkey. The next slide, please. Before February 24, 2022, the efforts of the Tatar diaspora in Turkey were aimed at ensuring that Crimean Tatars remained in Crimea. However, following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this sentiment shifted due to the threat of annihilation. The next slide. After Russia declared mobilization in 2022, including on the territory of occupied Crimea, approximately 1,000 Crimean Tatars left the peninsula for Turkey. The next slide, please. In anticipation, 1,500 Crimean Tatars were served with conscription notices. In response to these actions by the occupying authorities in Crimea, the representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, Tamila Tasheva, informed that since the onset of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation has been targeting Crimean Tatars seeking to eradicate the gene pool of the Crimean Tatar people. The next slide, please. It is worth remaining that conscription of residents of occupied territories into the ranks of the occupying army is prohibited under Article 51 of the Geneva Conventions and constitutes a war crime, compelling citizens of Ukraine to participate in combat actions against their own state. Okay, the next slide, please. Furthermore, yes, we can see the words of Tamila Tasheva, their content about which I mentioned, and the next slide, please. Furthermore, Russian forces have established a network of pseudo-Crimean Tatars organizations, the Federation of Crimean Tatars Dernex in Turkey, in order to sway the Crimean Tatar diaspora to their side. In response, Turkish Crimean Tatar Dernex have signed a joint declaration recognizing only those Crimean Tatar leaders who were elected under democratic conditions and prior to the occupation before 2014, asserting that only they represent the official viewpoint of the Crimean Tatar diaspora. And the next slide, please. The recognition of Crimean Tatars as indigenous people at the legislative level took place on March 20, 2014, when 283 deputies in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine voted for the corresponding statement. And the next slide, please. To summarize up, today, the Crimean Tatar diaspora in Turkey is an ally of Ukraine. Diaspora leaders decline their readiness to politically and financially support Crimean Tatars in Crimea, which in their opinion should be Ukrainian, as they did before 2014. Additionally, Crimean Tatars in Turkey unite their compatriots in other countries around the world to support Ukraine. Even before 2014, the Turkish diaspora supported the return of Crimean Tatars to Crimea in every possible way. After the Russian occupation began, they started helping them to leave Crimea to avoid imprisonment, illegal mobilization, and so on. Moreover, in Turkey, diaspora leaders primarily engage in active informational work to counter Russian propaganda aimed at discrediting Crimean Tatars. They often have to debunk myths about their cooperation with Russian businesses in Crimea or in Turkey. Overall, despite the challenges faced by the Crimean Tatar diaspora in Turkey since the occupation of Crimea in 2014, they managed to overcome them successfully. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And we continue with our next presenter, Yaroslav Bozhko. He is the speaker of the movement of public peaceful resistance to the occupation, Yellow Ribbon. In 2022, the Yellow Ribbon movement, together with other fighters of Ukrainian integrity, received the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought from the European Parliament, the main award of the European Union in the field of human rights. And his speech, Civil Resistance in Occupied Territories of Ukraine 2022-2024. Yaroslav, welcome.
Thanks for your organization for this event. Thanks for who listen and who watching our event. My name is Yaroslav Bozhko. I am representative of the Yellow Ribbon Civil Resistance Movement that works at the occupied territories of Ukraine, at the southern part of Ukraine, at the Donbass, and at the Crimea. First of all, I should say that the Russian occupation of the Ukrainian territories was absolutely illegitimate, was absolutely unpredictable for most part of the Ukrainian citizens here. So resistance movement is one of the main answers from the people of the Kherson, Genitchesk, and other cities. Yellow Ribbon Civil Resistance movement started in Kherson in first day of March of 2022, and it was the first stage of the civil resistance, because at the first stage of occupation, absolutely peaceful protests and demonstration against Russian occupation still was possible for first 2 or 3 months. So a lot of activists, a lot of pro-Ukrainian people take part in it, and Yellow Ribbon Civil Resistance Movement take part in organization and support for this rally, for these meetings, for these demonstrations, up to the June 2022, when the Russian occupation regime becomes more powerful at the occupied territories. So civil resistance movement should choose another tactics and go to the more hidden actions connected with protecting of Ukrainian identity, showing Ukrainian symbols in occupied cities, and providing campaigns against illegal elections, illegal passportization, and illegal mobilization to the Russian army provided by Russian government. Today, we understand that Russian government still hasn't full control at the occupied territories, because main part of the people of the occupied territory still does not recognize Russian state as legitimate power, still does not support Russian state system, and a lot of Ukrainians who still live in Kherson region, at the occupied part of the Kherson region, Zaporizhia region, even in also Crimea and Donbass, they does not support any actions of Russian forces. A lot of them try not to pay taxes to the Russian state system. So now we have such situation that occupied part of Kherson region and occupied part of Zaporizhia region is absolutely relied on dotations from Russia, because main part of Ukrainians does not pay taxes. Now we saw about 99% of dotations to the Kherson occupational regional government here. Russia trying to provide a lot of their actions to spread their political systems to the occupied territories. First of all, they try to create another ideological work in schools, providing a lot of propaganda of different topics connected with Russian narrative that especially underline that any Ukrainian or Crimean Tatar part of the history of these regions are not the main part, and it's just only the same Russia as in Voronezh or Rostov or Astrakhan or in another part of Russia. Still, we have a lot of problems with human rights and with rule of law on these territories. Even we try to compare the situation in world-recognized Russian territory, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and compare them to the occupied Genichesk, Kherson, Melitopol, Crimea, we will see that situation is worse than in occupied territories, and Russia provide a lot of actions that also break not only the international law, but break the Russian laws at all, break all these rights that Russian citizen has in their own cities. So we, honestly, we can absolutely describe this regime as an occupation of world-recognized Ukrainian territory. So Ukrainian peaceful protest now is maybe the only one form of protest for main part of Ukrainians who lived at the occupied territories, because most of them hasn't such skills that gains them possibility to take part in any military or partisan actions, and a lot of them hasn't such knowledge that give them any other opportunity to take part in military actions against Russian occupants. But it's also not weakness, but it's also a part of strongness of peaceful movement organizations, because we understand that peaceful organization and peaceful movement can be very wide, then can include a lot of social, ethnical, age groups, all types of people can take part in Ukrainian peaceful protest. For these actions, Ukrainian protest organizations such as Yellow Ribbon created special internet resources, such as Telegram bot Razum, Telegram bot Ochi, named ICE. Within, we can communicate with a lot of people from different cities of the occupied territory of Ukraine, give them some information, give them some posters that they can print. And I should say that at the occupied territories also work a large number of Ukrainian secret print stations. Some of groups of the peaceful protesters print their own magazines or leaflets that promoting pro-Ukrainian point of view on all situations that are provided at the occupied territories. The second big part of the work of the Yellow Ribbon Civil Resistance Movement, connected with protecting our people from the violation of the human rights. We're trying to collect all this information, work with different peacemaking and other human rights organizations, give them this information about the real situation at the occupied territories of Ukraine. Now we understand that collect this information in general become very, very serious problem for main part of the World Human Rights Organization, because Russia does not provide any actions of an public NGO that not conducted and not connected with Russian NGOs, not connected with Russian government, and are not registered in Russia. The third problem is a problem with free speech, problem with free sharing of political, social, and religious beliefs at the occupied territories. And now we heard a lot of information about violating of people's right to speech or to share some political or social values that cannot be conducted with Russian official state propaganda position. We heard a lot about the situation with different religious groups, such as Свидетели Иеговы at the occupied territories, with Orthodox Church of Ukraine, with Greek Catholic Churches of Ukraine, with different Muslims, Crimean Tatar religious organizations, and so on and so on. So we can underline that Russia are not provide any sort of freedom of speech at the occupied territories, and Russian state security organizations trying to control all types of social, political, and religious organizations that still worked at the occupied Crimea, occupied part of the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Lugansk, and Donetsk oblasts. Also, we understand that the main topic for the 2024 in Russian political life will be absolutely illegal president elections provided by Russian government. Also, we worked with different way to gain more information from the occupied territories about the real situation, how the Russian government trying to use administrative resources to create a push on the people to take part in, to create different types of local using of administrative resources through schools, through medical institutions. Now we understand that most part of the occupied territories are controlled by Russia in very, very authoritarian way. For example, you cannot give a normal, you cannot have normal access to the medicine, to any social care without Russian passport. So Russia made it maybe the most significant part of their political control among the region. Also, we understand that local occupation governments of these regions are very politically weak. Often they use just only a symbol. We understand that real power at the place has Russian state security agencies, Russian military, but not Russian local government organizations. And we cannot speak about Russian civil society here. We understand that all this structure that created in Russia was spread into the occupied territories. They trying to create a UNARMIA movement at the occupied territories. They try to create some another types of public organizations, such as Youth Guard, Молодая гвардия, that maybe seen for Russians as part of their influence for this region, and one of the way to create a more stable authoritarian regime, to give them a place to give them some places at local government, to give them some part of their Russian money. And we understand that most part of work of the occupied territories, local governments provided by Russia, is absolutely dependent on people who was sent from Russia. Yes, a lot of Russian specialists, such as political experts, political governors, and sent it from another regions of Russia, from the Rostov-on-Don, from the Moscow. And also the same situation with different military and security organizations. So we should underline that people at the occupied territories still waiting for Ukraine, still would like to express their pro-Ukrainian views, even if had such problems with it. Western work with these topics are not very wide, because we hadn't such a lot of information for the Western media as we need, because Russia trying to cut any ties with Ukraine, cut ties to Ukrainian internet resources. But we believe that in one day, Ukrainian flag will return into the Crimea, into the Donetsk, Lugansk, Sevastopol, Genitsk, and Melitopol. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yaroslav. Thank you. And now here has come the time for asking questions. And if you have questions, you just show me, and I will start with the question to all speakers in the context of our discussion. In general, of course, it's terrible, but the most shocking part for me here is not so much the looting which happens in war, but the intentional and cynical destruction of culture heritage. Both reclaiming pre-modern objects as a part of extended Russian historical space, including Greek and Sarmatian materials, and erasing the Ukrainian modernistic cultural tradition, which was in dialogue with the Russian culture, but was not a part of it. Those in many ways completing the work of erasure during Stalinist time. We can actually see this in the occupied Crimea, destruction of Ukrainian identity and the identity of native-born people like the Crimean Tatars. So how can we, cultural workers and researchers, resist this? So
perhaps it was a question for the colleagues who was speaking, and I was really, and for me as well. So I'm really thankful to Elmira, who took our attention to the renaming, which is really a great part of colonizational politics. And perhaps you, Elmira, will add to the answer to this question. Will you?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for this question. I think that it is too important to document all these type of violations related with cultural heritage. And we can get that we do it for 4 different purposes for using this information. I mean, documentation of violations of international humanitarian law in sphere of cultural heritage protection. First of all, it is for assess the damage for future program, our national program for renovation of all these cultural objects. Second, it is too important for justice, because we are working with prosecutor office, some organization and our organization too prepared some documentation to International Criminal Court about this kind of violation related with cultural heritage. And justice is maybe the significant purpose for this kind of activity. The next purpose is for reparation, because I strongly believe, as our speakers mentioned above, that Crimea, Kherson, some regions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Lugansk regions will be free. And after all this big war, we need to prepare some documentation for reparation. And of course, for rethinking, reimagine cultural heritage in order to get rid of colonial narratives. And I think these four purposes the answer for this question.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, I will just add, not speaking only of the heritage, not speaking only of the archaeological heritage or historical heritage, the renaming works really good right now in the Crimea. Even when a small bench is put in the park, it is called the bench of Catherine II or a bench of Pushkin or whatever, which is Russian. And it sounds really funny for the people who lives right now. But then when this small table lives on this bench, or this other like signs go on living, and the community, the governing community have this in their list of the places, it's like making the steps to further colonize, making the steps to actually have these like points to return. I think that Russians know very well that the Crimea will be say independent from Russia, and then those small signs will continue their work on the benches, on the archaeological sites. Because I turned to Elmira because she was speaking of Tatar sites, and I was speaking about the ancient Greek sites mostly. They are all reorganized in a manner useful for the Russian propaganda. So this is the most dangerous thing, and this is actually what we should speak now. So what we can do? The question was, what can we do? The like researchers and cultural workers, we can inform. We can collect the information and inform at this stage.
We can research, of course, and we can document all these violations. This.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Probably I have a question. Do you hear me, or we can probably repeat if they don't hear me? I just wonder if any kind, because we are in Switzerland, we have a lot of international organizations, UNESCO and other organizations who works in cultural protection. I just wonder if we know that Crimea is not recognized as the part of the Russian, is somehow probably our speakers know if there is any opportunities, like, you know, to work with this kind of international organization, or it's just not possible, like, to work directly with UNESCO because as Crimea is not recognized and it's the part of the Russian Federation.
Do we have some opportunity to work with UNESCO? The question is.
Yes.
Probably at least to register, or somehow it's not possible as the Crimea is not, you know, like officially recognized. It's a little bit, you know, it's complicated. If it's possible, any kind of collaboration with like official international organization who work, you know, in this kind of the cultural protection, you know, to register at least or collect information. Just my question, I have no idea if it's possible or not.
I could at least start answering this question. that in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, UNESCO was making the report on the cultural heritage in the Crimea. And the report was really negative, as they stated that almost all the fields they are responsible for, there are really deep violation of the law. And of course, our Russian colleagues working in archaeology, because I know this side, they were all like claiming that these results were not quite true, that they can come to the Crimea and see that everything is blossoming, flourishing, etc., etc. But still, we have this report. We have this monitoring, say, which would be useful to inform the international organizations. I hope our colleagues speaking online could hear the question. And if you would like to add something, we would be thankful.
I'd like to add some information. You're absolutely right, Tetiana, that I don't remember, in 2020, maybe, yes, the UNESCO made a decision about establish some monitoring action on the territory of Crimea, of course, but it's not related only with cultural heritage. It's related with mandate of UNESCO. It's related with education sphere, in sphere of science, human rights, and cultural heritage, and something, journalists, this media. And during all these years, Ukraine, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine prepared some special information with non-government organizations, of course, and permanent representative of President of Ukraine in Autonomous Republic of Crimea, of course, about situation in Crimea. What I can say, it is really not direct some activity that help us to protect cultural heritage, to protect people, to stop all these violations related with cultural human rights and other, etc. But it was the political recognition that Crimea is part of Ukraine. It is too important. In December last year, in 2023, our organization with the Institute of Archaeology of National Academy of Science of Ukraine and I don't know in English, maybe Tetiana said me, the Spilka Archeologів України.
The Association of Archaeologists of Ukraine.
Yes, of Ukraine. We together hold an event in UNESCO related with cultural heritage, not only in Crimea, in situation with cultural heritage on occupied by Russia territories. And we said about erasure of Crimean Tatar identity in Crimea. We said about the appropriation, the cultural institution, cultural property, cultural heritage in these territories. We said about some using in military purposes of archaeological sites in this territory. We said about museums that was attacked and about demolition of these museums and some even human rights violations related with people who are working in museum and not want to work with Russian occupied authorities. And the more than 30 delegates, the members of UNESCO, attended our event. And I think it was the start of this communication with international organization by non-government sector and Ukrainian government with UNESCO. But I said that this war, Russia-Ukrainian military war, has shown, unfortunately, the inadequacy of international human system of cultural heritage protection, particularly cultural heritage protection. And now we haven't got any direct tools or mechanisms that really protect our cultural heritage in these territories. And I think the mission of Ukraine now, having this unique in one side and in another hand, very tragic experience, to unify this experience and invent some new tools and the new mechanisms of cultural heritage protection as an international tools, international mechanism, in order to not only protect cultural heritage in armed conflict, but to prevent such conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any question? Yes, please.
Just a small question.
Can you just?
I have just a small question to Galyna. Could you please specify which exact institutions from Moscow are excavating in Crimea? You said it's several.
Galyna Sagan is here, but you're asking about the institutions excavating, so it's for me.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so I wanted to pin Galyna for her to ask, but that is me to ask. So please repeat your question, because I was thinking about pinning Galyna.
Yeah, sorry. You say
What are the
several
institutions?
institutions are excavating. I suppose it's RAN and someone else.
Yes, of RAN, it is the Institute of Archaeology, the Institute of, I'm just translating the name, of Material Culture of RAN. And there are universities as well. And the universities, if you are interested, I could give you the list of them, because they widely publish their reports. And so this is open information, and yes, I can give you to it. It's like a couple universities from Moscow and some universities from other cities. And for me, yes, the thing, it is very actually weird, because before 2014, before the occupation, the Russian colleagues and Russian institutions were widely expected at the Crimean sites. It was not some discovery of Crimea. They were not even allowed, they were welcomed to study. And they indeed participated in the research, they led the research. So it was not a thing to sudden entrance of them to the Crimea. But after 2014, the activity there is illegal, because it is contra the international law. And this is how we actually, this is one more fact for us to report for the violation of cultural heritage. Thank you for the question.
Dear friends, we move on to our second part of our discussion, and I want to open the roundtable discussion, Crimea, a case study of hybrid warfare. And I'm happy to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Oleksiy Polehky. He got his PhD in political science in Poland in Warsaw University. Also, he has PhD in social science. And now Dr. Polehky works in University of Zurich. Yes, and his speech assessing 10 years of Russia's annexation of Crimea and its impact on global geopolitics.
Thank you very much. I will start probably our discussion with attempt to make more kind of space for thinking and reflections. Because, of course, here we have the anniversary of annexation of Crimea, but at the same time we have 2 years of invasion of Ukraine. And one of the questions for me was like, actually, it seems very visible that one event without, second event without first would not be possible. But once becomes so unexpected for many people. For example, To be fair, I would start from myself. Like in 2021, I wrote one paper with some Polish colleagues about foreign policy in Ukraine, Russia, etc. And in conclusions, I wrote that the conflict between like Russia and Ukraine have existential and even ontological character. So this type of conflict, especially from a moment when Moscow made Ukraine one of the main points of its internal politics, it's impossible to solve except of like two variations. So one is total destruction of Ukraine as independent state, and second choice is total changes or destruction of political regime in Moscow. But at the same time, like in January 22, we had also one like webinar, and I told that yes, of course, we expected for kind of like provocations, etc., but full-scale invasion, full-scale war is really absolutely crazy idea. So I would say no, I would not expect this type of war as it happens in Ukraine in the last 2 years. And one of the first aspects which I would like to bring here, it's kind of cognitive, I don't know, deviation, biases, or how can we tell? Because it seems, especially when we are working in Western academia or experts, so-called, Russia was studied for many years. We have a lot of publications, analysis, etc. But actually, we had a lot of misperceptions of Russia. One maybe answer, we can say yes, Moscow is very well established in the so-called like reflexive game, etc., etc. So in this sense, we can say that majority of these special operations on the cognitive level was quite successful, because for many experts and scholars, and after as a consequences for politicians, many acts and steps made by Moscow was really unexpected. And why we could not actually see things as they are. And one like conclusion for me was, from one side, we should always keep in mind those ideas about like permanent game and postmodern approach and like reflexive games, which can be sent simultaneously contradictory messages from, let's say, Kremlin. But at the same time, sometimes we need to look at things and even words directly. Because if we will look on the rhetoric of political elites, and for example, Putin himself, it was absolutely openly proclaimed about war with the West, Ukraine as failed state or like really imaginary state, etc., etc. If we will look back in like 2007, we had Munich speech. In 2008, we had absolutely similar aggression against Georgia, etc., etc. Of course, for me, like it was maybe two kind of critical points for development of Russian foreign policy. First, it was Orange Revolution, and we can see how Russian rhetorics, Russian foreign policy was changed. So it was adopted idea that yes, soft power is working, so let's use it in our games, and all those idea about Russian world, etc., were developed quite significantly in Ukraine, but also in other countries. And second point, it was probably 2011 and 2012, so the Bolotnaya Square protest, and when probably we can imagine or we can conclude that for Kremlin, it was visible that next step, it would be kind of maybe a revolution or something in Russia. So what we can do, we need to react. We need to make more proactive actions. And I suppose that annexation of Crimea, it was an attempt actually to export a revolution outside of Russia. So in the search of stability for regime, actually annexation of Crimea was very successful. Let's say honestly, among almost absolute majority of Russians, this Crimean consensus becomes one of the main points for mobilization of society and support of Putin. If we look on the level of public support for personally for Putin, in 2013 it was one of the lowest level for his support. It was already equal numbers of people in Russia who claimed that they would vote for Putin or they would prefer someone new for the next presidential elections. After Crimea, we had like 83, 86% of support. And in 2019, actually situation comes to kind of similarity. It was higher level of support, but it was first year after Crimean consensus when support of Putin really goes down. And after it was COVID, so actually it was even worse situation. And if we will look on the, like 2022 from this perspective, we can see that actually it was absolutely unavoidable. It doesn't mean that this type or this shape of aggression would be absolutely unavoidable. And here I suppose it's another point. Very often, like Russian politicians say that West is side which should be blamed for a war in Ukraine. In partly, I would agree, but from absolutely different logic. I suppose if West would really shows its ability to act before, it would be probably a different situation. But when, for example, Biden said that we have no conditions that any US like soldier will fight in both Ukraine or in Ukraine, it was kind of green light for Putin that, well, we can try to make second attempt and achieve our aims as it was made in 2014. Second element, it's deeply connected with our previous session. It's actually with elements of imperial conditions. And here Russia is, acts as typical revanchist state, like imperialist state, but at the same time very specific because it's, at the same time it acts as a subaltern empire. But here I suppose it's quite big topic and my colleagues already told something and will talk. So we should keep in mind was all the machinery of imperialist production of knowledge about Ukraine, about Russia, about Crimea, about many aspects which not so well known, especially as it was 2 years ago for many people, for many scholars and many countries. And also we have consequences of it. We looked for many things in Ukraine through Russian lens. We, at least as I could see, like Western academia, Western expert society, very often it was framed, first of all, through Russian framing or Russian lens and disseminated, etc., etc. And third point, it's actually geopolitical situation and let's say bigger perspective. And in this situation, probably we already should not talk only about Ukraine or Russia. So it's really part of these global changes. And probably we could expect that situation in Ukraine could not be solved without all those problems which were not solved before. And here we have a lot of quite rational claims or maybe expectations from many people, like let's say for Western politicians, etc., etc. But what does it mean? It means that we have significantly, like it's really deep changes on very different levels, which happen simultaneously. I would mention only like technological, political, economical, but also it's our probably changes as a humanity. So with anthropological changes has very significant situation and influence on situation. And of course, it brings all together not solved questions to a political level and geopolitical level. So in this situation, for certain actors, like and in Russian case, it was kind of choice that if world is going to be changed, and we are not in the best situation, let's change the like games and the rule of games. So let's change world, and the idea that in chaotic world, we could manage better because we are ready for it. And like West would not be ready. Personally, for me, I suppose it was also a couple of events which probably was important to make this decision in Kremlin as it was made. It was on political level, US actions in Afghanistan, and second, its reaction towards COVID, because COVID shows that actually the fear is very useful instrument. Society, especially Western society, were ready to give up with many levels of, let's say, freedoms in the change of security and etc. So with continuous blackmail from Russian side about nuclear, for example, catastrophe is perfectly wrong. And it's also part of what I mentioned, like reflexive games, that actually in these conditions, it was chosen as a very appropriate way. We can do what we can, and or we can say another way, we will do only because we can do, and not in other situations, but at this situation, because we have some situation with different, let's say, circumstances, which create a unique moment for Russia. Because on the next level, probably it would be much more difficult to compete with other countries as Russia was not actually so developed as many other countries, etc., etc. And with geopolitical shifts is going on. We have China, we have competition or US-China, and here we can do, it's kind of windows of opportunity. So here I will stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexei. And I want to present you our next speaker, Roman Gorbik. Dr. Gorbik joined the Ukrainian Research in Switzerland program in the University of Basel 3 weeks ago. He is doing a very topical research project on the role of modern media in present days warfare. He has excellent experience in the media as he is a well-known journalist in Ukraine. He has publication in top journals such as Urbanist, Історична Правда, Український Тиждень, Focus, etc. So Dr. Gorbik will speak strategic narratives and historical context of the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea.
Yes, thank you so much, Anastasiia, for this wonderful introduction. Too kind, maybe, and good evening already, dear colleagues. I really can't express, enough how happy I am to be here. I mean, it wasn't that easy getting to Lausanne this day, and the final obstacle was that my glasses broke, and it made my navigation in the city where I'm for the first time quite difficult, and as a result I can't see you too well. So this is what you can hear, right? But I can hear and I can talk and I can maybe see something of my presentation. So I hope that it will make sense, but it makes me extra happy to be able here in person and talk to you. So as Anastasiia told you, I work mainly on media, on various aspects. I'm a media scholar. And I have drifted mainly in the direction of media and technology and the uses of technology in war, which is something that preoccupies me mostly these days. But I will talk about something different today because I couldn't really find an interesting technological angle to the annexation of Crimea 10 years ago that would be relevant today in the same way that narratives and discourses would be. So instead, I decided to do like a tiny micro study of how strategic narratives were employed back in 2014 and some years later. So in the immediate wake of the annexation of Crimea by Russia. And, I remember very well those days. I go back to those days quite often in my memories. And I remember, how I was in Ukraine during the Euromaidan, the decisive phase. I was on Maidan during the shootings on the 20th of February. Then a few days later, I left Ukraine just as Yanukovych left it in an opposite direction. And then one clear memory that I have is how when, the little green man already started taking over the administrative buildings in Crimea, at the very same time, literally simultaneously, as the Russian Council of the Federation was debating the permission to use the armed forces in Ukraine, the permission for Putin to authorize him to do that. The leadership of the European Union held sort of a summit or a forum discussing, it was literally titled Narrative for Europe. And I remember myself tweeting quite hectically and frantically at José Manuel Barroso, and other dignitaries who were sitting there, it was very visible, very sensible that they were kind of engulfed in this a sense of security and, the significance of this forum discussing what the future narrative for the European Union should be, and I was tweeting at them, hey, you should look the other way because, something is going on in Ukraine, in Crimea, where is your reaction? What are you going to do about that? That is the narrative that needs your attention. It's not narrative actually, but you maybe need to make it part of your narrative. Well, you can imagine the reaction, of course, it was silence, silence speaks louder than words, but let's have a more specific look, beyond the anecdotal evidence. So, what is strategic narrative to begin with? Yes, thank you so much. So this is a concept that is quite familiar, I think, to especially media scholars, but also I think it is quite often employed in international relations. It is quite usual in different approaches to security studies. And the main book by Miskimon, O'Loughlin, and Rosell was published not such a long time ago, where they propose and explain this concept as a way to acknowledge the changing media landscape and how international relations are increasingly about narratives that are constructed in complex way through a plurality of actors, and where also connectivity and open-endedness of narratives is really important. So it is more specifically defined. I think it is quite important to actually pay attention to that definition as a means for political actors to construct a shared meaning of the past, present, and future of international politics, to shape the behavior of domestic and international actors. And it is specifically important in times of crisis, because it is when the actors in international relations tend to make an especially active use of strategic narratives. They kind of need recourse to strategic narratives to kind of build an idea about how the future way out should look like, you know, and why we ended up here and what is happening in principle. So it is a temporal, of course, structure as any narrative. And it is also seen as a part of strategic communication or public diplomacy. So it has a strategic aim to persuade others. And it is mostly constructed by strategic actors in within international relations, we can say. But it is also in this new media landscape, it is also open to other actors who can collaborate on that. And some specific dimensions that the theorists identified are what the characters and actors are, what is the setting, the environment, what is the conflict exactly, what is happening right now, and what is the resolution or suggested resolution in the future of this crisis, right? We can go to the next slide. So thinking about that, I asked myself a question, and I don't think there are too many answers on that in research. Well, I don't want to present it as like, you know, some super fundamental study, you know, it's just a small and very narrow look into what was happening immediately after Crimea was annexed. So I decided to, first of all, primarily look at the two speeches. One made by Vladimir Putin on the 18th of March, as he basically advocated and proposed his, you know, the incorporation of Crimea following the referendum into the federation. And then the second best thing that came from the West was probably the speech by Barack Obama on the 26th of March, 2014 in Brussels, Palais de Beaux-Arts, I believe, which is quite modestly titled on the archival website of the White House, remarks of President Obama to the European youth. So he was talking specifically to youth representatives, but most of the time he talked about Ukraine. So it's like probably the most comprehensive initial kind of reaction to this. Yes, let's go next. So now this is quite an overwhelming slide, and I'm sure you can't see it all. But let's say I can't really focus on it in depth for the lack of time. But it is important to know that both speeches deal a lot with history, that they are actually good examples of strategic narratives in action. They all present a vision of the present rooted in the past, but whereas for the future, it is about the sacred kind of nature of Crimea for Russia, because of the baptism of Prince Volodymyr in Khersonas, which for Putin has something to do with Russia, right? It's like it is seen as the cornerstone of the Russian identity, you know, which is, of course, contested and should be contested, but that's his perspective, right? The takeover of Crimea in the 18th century, the Crimean War, the Second World War, and so on. Obama talks also a lot about history, but about how the values of democracy and human rights were hard-won values in the battles of the First and the Second World, right? So these are quite different directions. Then Putin, after this historical introduction, he ventures into what I call the 5 grievances that he uses as a motivation for the annexation. So first, the grievance of the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine 1954, which according to him was unjust and in violation of the Soviet legal framework, which is of course false, but that's once again what he says. Then the very grievance of the Soviet Union's dissolution, right? So that very thing was unfair, like he already spoke about it many times in Munich as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century and so on. Then the assimilation and persecution of Russians in Crimea, which once again, of course, is completely false, but that becomes another, like the third great grievance he identified. And then the economic failure of Ukraine, basically that Ukraine cannot take care of Crimea or Russians in Crimea. and eventually what he presents as the Nazi or neo-Nazi coup and terror against Russian speakers. Yeah, right. Once again, all false narratives, but that's what he says. Well, if we look at what Obama constructs as a strategic narrative, we'll see actually, instead of these like trying to address actually, because and he speaks a whole week later than Putin, instead of addressing the core tenets of the Russian strategic narrative, he actually spends most of his time on conflict avoidance, on presenting the events in Ukraine, the Euromaidan revolution, of course, and other things as a genuine grassroots action where like we have nothing to do with it, basically. Then he also, like, quite curiously, he says like, well, we will win anyways because our ideas are true. So like it almost is like we don't have to do anything for that. Right. Then he repeats several times that it's nothing against Russia. It's just in protection of international law. And yes, we are imposing sanctions and downgrading relations with Russia, but this is not punishment, and there will be no Cold War over this, only diplomacy. Right. Then they both address legality, and whereas Putin tries to assert that there was no violation here because the troops were already there, so he was kind of legal because of that. Make out of it whatever you want. And then he also decides the nation's right to self-determination and also the Kosovo precedent, which Obama also names, but he only uses defensive legality. He only speaks about like, well, Kosovo is really a different kind of thing. And Iraq was also like, yeah, it was bad, and I was against it when it was happening. But we didn't annex anything of Iraq. We left. So he only kind of defends the US as a non-actor, their status as a non-actor here, and says nothing about Russia's agency. And then also Putin speaks quite a lot about the legitimacy. So it's quite short on legality, but a lot on legitimacy, which he motivates through the bloodlessness of this takeover of Crimea. Once again, not true, right? People died as a result of that, but he does mention that. They allegedly brought support for this move in both Russia and Crimea. Also, the West's deliberate interventions in what he sees as the Russian legitimate sphere of influence, so the color revolutions, things like that. And basically, he says that Russia had been chased into a corner. And Obama, probably maybe as a way to address it, like I'm speculating here, that spends a good deal of time on appeasement once again. So he says that it's actually a good thing that the West is confronted, that there are new powers on the rise, such as Russia, one can imagine. He doesn't name it directly, but one can imagine that it's a good thing, according to him, that he says we want a strong Russia, a democratic one, but a strong Russia, of course. And we all make our own choices, and there is no easy answer, essentially. So once again, like he constructs quite a complex way for him to kind of move away from this situation. And then speaking about the future, what Putin says is quite funny because he says we support the territorial integrity of Ukraine and will never annex other regions. And Obama said, like, we have to use our power to affirm our values, which sounds good, but I'm not sure that's what happened. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So, of course, one thing that is especially important is that Putin raises this, unlike Obama, who also speaks about history, but Putin raises it to the level of political theology. He speaks about the sacredness of Crimea for Russia, and several months later, at the end of the year, in his address to the Russian parliament, he says that Crimea for Russia is the same as the Temple Mount in Jerusalem for those who profess Islam and Judaism. you know. So and of course there is a lot to debunk here, you know, and they spend a lot of resources doing that, you know. This picture actually comes from a movie called The Viking, which a Russian movie, and an interesting example, quite a crappy movie, so I don't recommend watching it unless you want to ruin your evening. I mean, it's really poorly made, and you know, like the storytelling is quite poor, but it constructs this a story of Prince Volodymyr, who basically had nothing to do with Russia as it exists today, and he didn't really have anything to do with the core, the medieval core of the principalities of Vladimir and Suzdal, out of which Muscovy eventually developed, right? I mean, of course, he's also controlled by way of his status as the king, de facto, we can say, of this empire of Rus, with the center in Kyiv. Of course, he controlled some lands that later became Russia. But here he's presented as unquestionably Russian. The Viking apparently was used only as a bait in title, so there is nothing really Viking about him. He's just a confused Russian man, you know, like prone to violence, you know, and chaotic in so many ways and so on. But then, you know, Christianity that he finds in Crimea, and this is the final scene of baptism. I don't remember exactly, that probably represents Kyiv, but I think they also have a really pathetic scene of baptism in Crimea, which looks totally fake and probably completely misrepresents what actually happened. Actually, medievalists have huge doubts about Volodymyr's baptism in Crimea, actually, so it probably was a fabrication by medieval chronists. Well, in any case, we see a whole complex of Russia, of the Russian and Russocentric, the Moscow-centric narrative of history, especially early medieval history, that is mobilized. That is hotly contested by the Ukrainian historiography, for example, right? But not so much, sadly, in the West. And this is one of the problems that I think we need to raise. It's time to talk about how bad our West European medieval historiography of Eastern Europe is, specifically of the Kiev Rus and, you know, the state that developed out of it later. Of course, Obama has nothing to say about it. And the West literally ignored it, which was, I would argue, acceptance by ignoring it. Please, the next slide. So if we look more closely at Western weaknesses, you know, just to enumerate quickly some of them. So lack of clarity on the actors, no interaction with history, basically agreeing with the Russian claim of historical legitimacy to Crimea, even though Crimea only became part of the Russian polity in the late 18th century and was part of what can be seen as modern Russian state for like 30 years in the early 20th century. Complete defensiveness, reactiveness, so a lack of pro-action in any way. But also what is probably one of the worst things, the lack of clarity regarding the vision of the future. Now, what about Ukraine, right? Did Ukraine have not any strategic narrative about itself and about the international system they had to tell the world? Right? Well, initially it was quite weak, and it was basically about like, this is unjust and we want to get back what is ours. But gradually, Ukraine tried to develop a more far-reaching strategic narrative that would appeal to practically a broad circle of actors in international relations, other states and governments. So as an example, President Poroshenko spoke to the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2016, in 2017, and so on. So he basically constructed this situation as a failure of the international community, quite directly, straightforwardly. He focused on the human rights violations, on the presence of mercenaries, on the kidnappings in Crimea, and he presented it as everyone's dilemma, right? Either we choose self-deception and screw the situation even more, or we try to find a just resolution, you know, which he saw and presented as Ukraine's strategic narrative, what we can say about the entire global political international system, you know, how we want it to change is that we need a reform of the UN, and there need to be consequences for Russia, and the bigger mandate for the Secretary General of the United Nations in particular, right? They disappeared. Now, of course, it was not only about Poroshenko. Zelensky was quite passive about Crimea in the first years, but in 2021, he initiated the Crimean platform. In practice, the only tool that Ukraine created to basically ensure the return of Crimea. And quite curiously, I mean, he repeated a lot of Poroshenko said, but then he also kind of opened it for Russian participation. And that was just 6 months before the full-scale invasion. So he said, like, we invite Russia here. We want to see Russia here. We want to talk to Russia about this. And he said that I believe that Russia's signature will be at the last summit of the Crimea platform in Yalta. Right, and of course, this is an initiative that exists and expands. It has expanded since the full-scale invasion and so on. And if we look also at other actors who participated in the strategic narratives, like we will see very briefly, I will just refer to my article, which I co-wrote with Daria Orlova, that Russia basically managed to successfully use and subvert the Western perspective on journalistic standards in mainstream media, and successfully use the idea of balance to construct, you know, a both-sidesism kind of version of the events in the style of both sides trade accusations, you know, but we cannot really know what is happening. So that was the main take on this in the mainstream media, and also in the in social media, the dynamic was also quite inconclusive, as this classical example comes from Andrew Hoskins and Ben O'Loughlin and their article on the Arrested War. You know, when Canada at NATO tweeted at Russia, some Russian account, sort of a guide of how to for their troops who were allegedly getting lost, you remember, in the summer of 2014 in Ukraine, on how to not to get lost in Ukraine, you know, the Russian embassy tweeted back at them, or the Russian, some kind of Russian account, maybe more informal Russian account, which was still a tool of public diplomacy, that you need to get updated on you know, the geography. Right, that Crimea is now part of Russia. And so it was like trading back and forth, maybe NAFO, since the full-scale invasion, changed this a little bit because they used asymmetrical approach. They were proactive, they were asymmetrical, right? All the things that were lacking in this. So some of my conclusions are that Russia managed to build a strategic narrative that was strong enough to stalemate the narrative war. And some of the key tools were manipulation with poorly known history, arguments from the facts on the ground, and legality based on the previous perceived wrongdoing by the West, and the legitimacy based on the idea of Russia's sovereignty beyond its borders. And the Western strategic narrative was doomed to fail because it was reactive, it was defensive, it was never proactive. It lacked the will to confront the historical manipulation, and it actually prioritized acknowledging Russia over maintaining Ukraine's sovereignty. And then Ukraine tried to build a persuasive narrative on why it matters for everyone in terms of the global order, but the effort was insufficient, I believe. And then more overarchingly, I can say that Russia successfully promotes the narrative in the spirit of Carl Schmitt, that there are sort of two levels. It's not my idea, I think, but I think it's really relevant here, that there are two levels of sovereignty in a way. The true sovereignty of regional hegemons like the US and Russia, and then the limited sovereignty of small states. And this is a highly problematic narrative for the West, because the West believes in only one type of sovereignty, you know? And the lack of Western confrontation with this led to the partial acceptance of such two levels sovereignty de facto, unfortunately. Also, it raises issues about the understanding of strategic narrative as a concept by the authors who proposed it, but I will skip it for the lack of time. I think it's interesting that they know that, you know, they see it as an alternative to unilateral action, but in fact, we see that it can be perfectly combined. And overall, I think it raises for me huge question marks around what the actual aims of the West were back in 2014, and well, at least until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horbek. And I want to present you our next speaker, Dr. Antonina Skidanova. She was a lecturer at the National University of the Air Force of Ukraine in Kharkiv. After Russia's full-scale invasion, she was given the opportunity to work under SARS program at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland and at the Department of Contemporary History. Her current research focuses on the social context of military history in the early 20th century and the history of the Ukrainian Red Cross in the first half of the 20th century. And her speech is the struggle of the military history of Crimea in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war.
I'm thankful for the presentation, and I'm thankful for the previous speaker, because I think I can raise some topics which will be connected with your topics about the strategic narratives, but I will talk about history and history narrations and policy of memory. And so we are waiting for the presentation. I think I can start, because the first what I want to say, everyone knows about that, perhaps. Those who have ever been within the Russian informational field can immediately recognize the phrase Sevastopol is the city of Russia glory. Sevastopol is one of the largest cities on the Crimea Peninsula, located on the Black Sea coast. It is important as a port and a naval base, but this expression, however, links Sevastopol to the glory of the Russian nation or the Russian state. In addition, it became the hallmark of the entire Crimea and for decades supported the construction of the Peninsula Russian affiliation. Next slide, please. The cliché about the city of Russian glory is associated with the historical memory about the defense of Sevastopol in 1854 and 1941 during the Crimean and Second World Wars. However, it still played a role as an ideological justification for an annexation of Crimea in 2014. This example is one of a number of instances that instrumentalized history is being used in the Russia-Ukrainian war. However, it is the topics of military history that occupy one of the leading places when it comes to the formation and use of the collective memory related to Crimea. Next slide, please. I will try to explain this phenomena and briefly summarize my observation on the evolution of the military history of Crimea as part of public historical discourse and commemorative practices in Russia and in Ukraine over the 10 years in the annexation of the peninsula. The key goal of my today's presentation will be subjective assessment of Ukraine's capabilities and the competition for the military history of Crimea, taking into account the prospects of its deoccupation. It was during the annexation of Crimea in 2014 that it became clear that the Formation of the collective memory is an effective tool in hybrid war. In the Ukrainian public sphere, this led to the active deconstruction of a number of historical myths, such as Crimea as the original Russian land, Crimea is the spiritual cradle of Russia, Crimea is the gift from Khrushchev, etc. It was a targeted post-facto reaction against myths, aimed mainly at their domestic audience, at Ukrainian citizens in the non-occupied territories. The discussion, however, raised a more complex question. Why was the successful spread of these myths possible in general? One of the answers was that during the years of independence, the grand narrative of Ukraine's history failed to offer an inclusive version of Ukraine-Crimea relations, or more precisely, failed to adequately include Crimea into Ukraine's history, unfortunately. The historical narrative about Crimea was undoubtedly in the history of Ukraine. Nevertheless, was it a history that showed the historical connection between cultures in their fullness and mutual influence? Probably not. Next slide, please. The most painful point was the historical narrative about Ukrainian-Tatar relations. It was based mainly on the military component of the interaction between the peoples during the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The permanent military conflict on the steppe frontier during this period was associated with the devastating raids by Crimean Tatars and the capture of the local population, which then became a commodity in slave markets of Crimea. Against the backdrop of this confrontation, the Cossacks acquired the image of the heroes and symbol of the nation as a border defenders and avengers. But this narrative of military history was based on the national optics and was important primarily for Ukrainian identity. Unfortunately, it was based on binary opposition. The Crimean Khanate and the Tatars were represented as the enemy of Ukrainians in the confrontation with whom Ukrainians were victims and heroes at the same time. The preservation of the binary opposition of defender, aggressor, victim, enemy in the representation of Ukraine-Tatar relation has in no way to contribute to the formation of civil understanding between ethnic groups in modern Ukraine. More than in this paradigm, the conquest of Crimea Khanate by the Russian Empire in the late 18th century was seen as a positive action. Further events of military history on the territory of Crimea were seen as events of general imperial significance on the territory of the modern Ukraine only. Crimea mostly eluded attention in descriptions of the Ukrainian Revolution and wars of 1917-1921. Next slide, please. So, the military history of Crimea in Ukraine until 2014 was mostly included in the Ukraine-centric narrative, imperial history, or avoided altogether. In the first case, this produced national grievances. In the second case, it legitimized the imperial narrative. In the later case, it ignored the Crimean history of opposition to the empire. The occupation of Crimea and the recognition of mistakes in formation of the historical memory have become catalysts for certain changes. New chapters on the history of Crimea have been added to the textbooks, monographs that emphasize the interaction between Ukrainians and Tatars have appeared, and commemoration of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars during the Second World War has been strengthened. However, the question remains, are these changes enough? It seems that Ukraine's strength in the battle for memory is pluralism of opinions and academic freedom. It seems that one of the most productive trends is the gradual shift from the Ukraine-centric to a multicultural dimension of Ukrainian history. Next slide, please. Another trend is a change in attitudes toward the conflict, including the military conflict. Of course, in the case of the Crimean Khanate, the long-lasting military confrontation cannot be erased, ignored, or replaced by the facts of interaction. However, according to the Ukrainian historian Aleksandrova, the conflict should be treated responsibly, without taking it a priority and a pretext for national grievances. It should be acknowledged that Ukrainians and Tatars are united by a long-lasting military conflict. This conflict intensified interaction. Accordingly, the mutual influence of cultures and various levels, from military, art to food. Perceiving history through this lens allows us to realize that the military history of the 15th, 18th century strongly connected the historical tracks of Crimea, Crimean Tatars, and Ukrainians, rather than divided them. Next slide. The Russian version of the historical memory of Crimea today is largely based on the meanings which were formed during the times of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Several key topics are actively used to shape collective memory. Among them, military and historical themes occupy a prominent place. These are the topics of the conquest of Crimea and the battles of the armies of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union in Crimea against the coalition of Western powers. Having occupied Crimea, Russia has an opportunity to support commemorative practice related to these topics. They are used to promote a scheme of history in which Russian conquest meant inevitable improvements in the life of Crimea and the empire as a whole. Next slide. The emotional appeal. The emotional appeal to the image of Crimea as a shield, advanced foothold, land drenched with Russian blood, not only sacralizes the space of Crimea as part of Russia, but also imposes a scheme of Russian fatal strategic dependence on Crimea. The abstract of a Russian popular book on military history published in 2016 described this as follows. For 500 years, Crimea has been a battlefield so often and so abundantly drenched with Russian blood that these blood tastes are stronger than any other. Next slide. This book reflects another trend also. For the author, the military history of Peninsula begins only in the 16th century, from the time of Ivan the Terrible, and continues until Putin's July operation to bring Crimea home. The book aims to explain why Russia will never accept the loss of Crimea. but the representation of the military history of Crimea is made purely through the dimension of the Russian state project. This is a colonial discourse. This colonial discourse is still as important part of Russia's political propaganda. Military and historical propaganda as a component of political propaganda is systemic, institutional, and centralized. It is mostly implemented through the Russian Historical Society and its Crimean branch, which was established immediately after the occupation. These structures are bureaucratic, using resources to access schools, organize mass public events, etc. This ensures the unity of message and broadcast and mass coverage. At the same time, these are rather inert structures that also neglect local initiatives. It seems that the propaganda is locked into Russian state structures. If they are eliminated, impulses to reproduce the imperial narrative on the public level will probably be insignificant. Next slide, please. Another weakness of Russian propaganda in the field of the military history is the nature of the commemorative practices. The events of the Second World War remain the most commonly used for educating young people and the most represented in the public space of memory. The social activities connected with the memory about so-called Great Patriotic War rely on the Soviet infrastructure of memory sites and repeat the scenarios of commemorative events of the Soviet era. Just like in the Soviet Union, they are mandatory, routine, and uniform. Are they effective? Partly yes. But they also increasingly resemble a formal obligation. During the 10 years of occupation, few new places of memory were created in Crimea by Russians, and all of them are quite traditional in form. The majority of places of memory are physically old and unattractive. All these turns the peninsula into a location of anachronism. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I will offer a few thoughts on the prospects in the battle for military history. Of course, the first and most important is the real battle for Crimea, in the Russia-Ukrainian war and the occupation of the peninsula. But does Ukraine have the potential to fight in the historical arena right now? Yes. And this is a way to change the historical grand narrative to a multicultural one. A memory policy built accordingly will contribute to the formation of an open society, and this project seems more attractive than the totalitarian one. Another advantage of Ukraine is the real opportunity to build historical solidarity with Crimea on the basis of anti-colonial discourse about the past, because both Ukrainians and the peoples of the Crimean Peninsula were subjected to colonial influence. In my opinion, this is a priority, because Russia is actually recolonizing the peninsula with the help of instrumentalized history and historical memory. In conclusion, I would like to note that the policy of memory is only part of a set of measures to reintegrate Crimea after the occupation, and Ukraine has a chance to formulate the necessary strategies for the future right now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And our next speakers, unfortunately, unable to join us online because of they are in Ukraine right now and because of missile fire. I apologize, and I hope you understand it. And we move on to our next speaker, our last speaker for today, Mykola Volkivsky. Dr. Volkivsky has now completed his contract in the University of Geneva and has received a scholarship from Tadeusz Kościuszko Foundation for 3 months research project at the USA University, for which we congratulate him. In addition to scientific activity, he is a president of the first International Ukrainian Foundation of Development. And his speech is 10 years of occupation of Crimea consequence. Please.
Thank you so much for this outstanding opportunity. And actually, I would like to talk more about the reality, what is going on around the Crimea problem. Last week, I just back from Brazil for Rio de Janeiro when I'm taking part as an expert to G20 ministerial foreign ministers meeting. And I'm trying to remind G20 countries, how it's important, how it's right now as active, to be in times of the conversation and negotiation about the Crimea. Of course, sometimes it's difficult, to talk about G20 countries right now. Why? Because of Troika countries is like the 3 most important, position right now in G20. It's India, like the latest, presidency of G20. This year it's Brazil, and next year it's South Africa. Sometimes we mention the BRICS countries, we didn't talk about the democracy. It's true, because instead of these 3 countries, 2 more countries left. That's Russia and China. Even from latest Johannesburg summit, it's supposed to be more, but in any case. I was, inspired, to speak with this Minister of Foreign Affairs about how they're looking forward for the future of Crimea, what's going on in the last 10 years. Some of them, some countries like Turkey, or some countries, which like much more closer historically for this issue, was positively thinking about that. But in any case, last time when we officially speak with Russia about the Crimea, it was in Antalya Democratic Forum 2022, when the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine was meeting the last time officially with Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. And we remember it was a discussions, and generally it wasn't crossed in any case any future relations in terms of any truthful agreements between 2 countries, of course. But in any case, it was last time when we officially negotiated Crimea issue with the aggressor, with the terrorist country. It's true. Next week, even this week, from 1st to 3rd March, it will be again Antalya Diplomacy Forum, And it was founded by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu. And I'm really sure it will be specific platforms, specific opportunities, and roundtable discussion regarding Crimea. It wasn't, published yet who will be from Ukrainian side participating, maybe for security reasons, but maybe with high-level representatives will be talking about the Crimea. Of course, because we marked 10th anniversary of annexation, and in any case, 18th of March, it's officially recognized by a terrorist country as Russia, as a Crimea, as a part of Russia, which nobody will never recognize, except, some not countries. But in any case, I was so surprised, I was so positively thinking about the Crimea platform. And you know why? Because Crimea was number 1 topic, which was first in history launched many countries. We know the 23rd of August 2021, when it's Crimea platform officially established. Since independence, Ukraine in 24th August 1991, the most numbers of officials came to visit Ukraine. Of course, because it was in the same time 30th anniversary of Ukraine, but in any case, Crimean issue was also number 1 talks prior to official day of independence. What we saw next? Next was sometimes, some steps by the leaders, to continue the dialogue. We remember the latest one in October in Prague, when the parliamentary was talking about the Crimea, they make some decisions. But in any case, as I said before, I'm not so optimistic about any agreements right now under G20, even if I'm taking part as an expert of these kind of movements. I'm more positively thinking about G7 countries. You know why? Because the ambassador representative of G7 was the first country who officially was taking part of Crimea platform. Yesterday, the Giorgia Meloni, or sorry, not yesterday, but even Saturday, 2 days from now, the Giorgia Meloni was visited Ukraine. And under G7 initiative, the presidency of G7 this year is Italy. It's very been strong part when we making forward in this issue. We know because of all G7 countries united around the Ukrainian problem and around the war in Ukraine, we don't have such leaders like G20 or, as President Zelensky yesterday mentioned, G19 countries. But in any case, it's more power right now to make decisions. But we are now in Switzerland. You know what? The next peace platform, of Zelensky initiative will be held in Switzerland. Yeah. And in my, for some resources which we receive it all the time, Crimea talks was negotiated, first of all, in Copenhagen last summer, sorry. The second step was in Jeddah, in August in Saudi Arabia, and the last one and next one was in Malta. And this one in Davos, 1 day prior to World Economic Forum, it was negotiation on the peace platform of Zelensky. What we will see, in my opinion, will be the first official negotiations. Maybe after that, with invitation by the Russia, which already was made by Ukrainian government presidential office prior to Crimea platform. But in any case, it will be first official conversation with world leaders. Of course, our distinguished speakers and guests was, talking about the history. Sometimes it's difficult to explain the Minister of Foreign Affairs of some world leaders. It's true. The issue of Crimea. Of course, they was thinking it's historical issue. They don't know too much about Soviet Union. They know what someone was gifting for someone, but in this position is Crimea's annexation. It's more difficult to explain rather than Donbass. Crimea, it's true. It's unbelievable, but it's true. But in any case, what needs to be done next? First of all, the Ukrainian representatives need to be sure that we will have and receiving more and delivering more knowledge about the Crimean problem, from under the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the countries, because right now we have around 89 countries under the 88, sorry, under Zelensky peace formula. It's mean there in the United Nations only 193, but in any case it's a lot of countries right now. And we know from some drafts which was made before Crimea to 5 topics. We don't know how will we cross the last line with official conversation which was made in April 2022 in Turkey, with Ukraine and Russia. But in any case, Erdogan said it's of the weakness of Western countries. It was something that didn't make enough right now after the occupation of Crimea. You know why he said? Because of course he is believed so closely by his political way of thinking as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Çavuşoğlu about the Crimea. They all the time officially under United Nations, under Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, they was totally support any movement to support Crimea because they originally know there are a lot of Tatars, they so close to Turkey. And this kind of movement is important. For my reason, it's maybe if it's this week, and if it should be done in month of anniversary of the annexation of occupation Crimea, it will be positive movement to moving forward. And we will see how any case of G7, G20 countries, or even Crimea platform will be moving forward, but we have at least some opportunities. Antalya Forum, we have the Crimea platform which is coming, we have the peace formula Zelensky, at least this year, can be the crucial moment to make it something important for this, to make it something different, and to moving forward, at least officially, with official statements by the countries, by signatures, by participations, because it's not just Ukraine proposed or even Crimea platform proposed. It proposed a much more number of countries. We will see how it will be changed, but we understand, we will know the Crimea is Ukraine, as all around all the world is understanding Crimea is Ukraine. G20 G19 understand Crimea is Ukraine, but we don't care about Russia. Thank you for your time and
Okay, your question, please, to our speakers. Yes, please.
My question is, when Crimea will be occupied, it's not a secret that there are many people in Crimea that support Russia. What relations will be between the population of Crimea and our Ukraine? How do you think?
Who want to answer this question?
Okay, I can start it. Part of my answer. No, first of all, I suppose everything depends how war in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine will be finished. So it's the main point, and of course it's different situation now and 2 years before, because war itself changed people's mind and relationship, etc., etc. I suppose that majority of people who moved from Russia after 2014, who are not citizens of Ukraine, it's totally different situation. And when you're asking about population, first question for me is, what do you mean? Because population of Crimea, if you're talking about 2014, it's one case. Population of Crimea right now, it's second case. What about Crimean or people from Crimea who left Crimea? So we don't have answers on this question. I suppose that unfortunately, it's not the case that we can, re-establish the relationship or something, because it is war and it will be fighting. So it's also changed situation. I suppose that in general, for Ukraine, there is good chance to deoccupy Crimea as well, and re-establish relations between population, let's say, who lived in Crimea before 2014. And when it's one of the region where really was biggest support for Russia and for Russian movements. But still, we had no significant, separatist movements in Crimea, which really took over population, except of Russian direct influence in 2014 and some attempt at the beginning of 90s. We remember Meshkov and other, let's say, again, Russian politicians who tried to play this game. Another point, I would say, it's a role and the fate of Crimean Tatars, because when we are talking, and here it was always about narrations, Ukrainian narrations, maybe Russian, but first of all, it's a native land of Crimean Tatars. And even in these historical arguments about Russian, let's say, Volga or etc., very often we need to bring this question on the table. And for Ukraine, it will be also. I don't see there is kind of, contradictions or competitions of vision of Crimea and fate of Crimea in Ukraine, because it's really belongs, first of all, as a native land to indigenous population of Crimean Tatars. But again, as a consequences of war, it could change somehow, but the main question, what would be consequences of? So at this point, it's senseless to discuss how and what kind of relations will be in Crimea without answer and reality, how actually war will be finished.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm totally agree with Alexei concerning the people who are the population in Crimea Peninsula and who will return to Russia and stuff like that, who will decide to be the motherland and stuff like that, and who will return to Crimea because it's a homeland for many of people. And I have to say that Ukraine, I want to be an optimist because Ukraine has a chance to build humanitarian policy right now. And one of the key questions, how, in which way we can return to Crimea Peninsula, I mean Ukraine, yes? We have to return, and we can to return to this peninsula with new ideas in humanitarian policy. And one of the parts of this humanitarian policy is a historical policy, and what Ukraine has to do, and I hope doing right now is built another kind of the narration concerning the Crimea, concerning the Crimean Tatars and different cultures which were on the territory of Crimea. This history is more inclusive. And this type of narration we really can build. Now I return to my report, but we really can build more open society. And what we can do is a preparation of Ukrainian society to reoccupation of Crimea and reintegration, and for building a new conversation with the people, to create new project right now in Ukraine in order to be willing to come with new ideas and new projects, and which will be more attractive to people. It's my main idea, and I hope right now we are underway of this process.
Thank you. Tetiana, please.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentations, because actually they give us an opportunity to understand what were the messages and what will be the messages. And the question was really, really good, because actually having this idea how the messages work, how the strategic messages work, we need to think of what will be the messages to the Crimean inhabitants, to the international community. And my question will be, so what will be the key message to people living in the Crimea? Because here, and I'm really glad we can speak about this here in Lausanne, here in Switzerland, because it cannot be spoken there in the Crimea, and people still receiving the messages of the occupier. But I had an opportunity to follow the messages which were made in the Crimea before the occupation. My parents live in the Crimea, so I was listening to the radio and to other mass media with very high curiosity, and the messages worked. The messages were divided into three parts, like each news and each radio station or television station, the local stations, they were divided into three parts. First of all, the chaos in Kyiv. Second, the local work, the local contribution, the work of local people. And second, the good future and the order, the proper order in Moscow. And that worked really good, because each simple thing, each simple event, like making milk or opening the factory, it was following the same message. It was following the same, narrative. So therefore, perhaps we should think now of what will be the proper narratives for after the occupation for the local people, because I'm really it's really hard for me to hear that the Crimea belongs to Tatars only, that the Crimea belongs to Russians only. There are many Ukrainians, and we received this fail message from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if I'm not mistaken, that there are we don't have any Ukrainians, good Ukrainians who stayed in the Crimea. We do. They stay silent, but we do. There are many Ukrainians in the Crimea. So what will be good messages for them for this deoccupation? Can we speak about this now? Thank
Who
you.
want to answer this question? Tetiana?
I guess might have some ideas. I mean, of course, that's a really good and a massive question. It's very hard to answer. I think it should be answered by the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian government should be thinking hard about it right now. I'm not sure they are, but I guess that's what we would like to see. And of course, I mean, if we try to draw lessons from other cases, right, from all cases where, let's say, strategic communication was effective, at least to some degree, we'll need to create different messages for different audiences. And also, I would like to tap into great comments made by my colleagues and co-panelists here. First of all, like the question of population, right? In 2014 and now, right? Something that Oleksiy specifically pointed out. I mean, it's quite clear that those people who have been brought in by Russia since 2014, they are not part of the solution, they are part of the problem. So it's quite likely they will have to leave in some way.
They will stay.
Yeah. Well, that's something that Ukraine needs to think about, right? How to make these people live in a nice way, because they are part of the injustice, that's been done to Crimea, and to the population of Crimea, in 2014 at the time of the annexation. Then, of course, there are people like groups like Crimean Tatars, and I think they should be addressed with the message of justice, right? We are here to bring justice, and justice to serve, to do justice to you, the ethnic group that was probably that suffered the greatest injustice in all of Ukraine, more than ethnic Ukrainians, historically, and it still happens, right? So I think Ukraine is not doing enough in terms of making the situation of Crimean Tatars visible, because I think this is such a tremendous case for successful communication for Ukraine that is not being used, we are not making use enough of the post-colonial approach. We are not talking enough about Crimea as a Russian colony, about Crimean Tatars as a colonized indigenous population. They was eventually like almost nearly replaced virtually after 1944 quite completely, right? An ethnic cleansing that is now being repeated for the third time in history. We were not making enough, in terms of addressing the global South, the Muslim countries, for example, right? We have all seen the case of Palestine, which, called forth such a huge wave of solidarity, right? And like we may, argue that, there are probably different reasons and factors at work here, but still it's a huge pool of resource and solidarity, that Ukraine is not tapping into enough, I think. Also, there are people who are neither Russians who were brought in after 2014, nor Crimean Tatars. So let's say Ukrainians and Russians who lived in Crimea before the annexation. Many of them left, just as many of Crimean Tatars left, right? So there will be, of course, a question of, purely economic justice, I think, the restitution of resources of the property and so on, because there was a lot of, in every Soviet or Russian occupation, it's one of the first things, the buildings change owners, apartments change owners and so on. So this is settler colonialism, right? So we need to, this is the way we need to talk about it, I think. And for those who still are there, I think many of them were probably, they found, the Russian promises appealing in some way. They try to make peace with it. They try to adapt, so maybe the message for them will be like, they promise you stones from the sky. You remember that, billboard, so now congratulations, you've made through it. You made through the stones from the sky. Now welcome back home, something like that maybe. And of course, it will not work for everyone because no communication is 100% effective. There is no magic bullet. But I think these are maybe some guidelines, that we may use at least to start thinking or talking about it. Thank you.
And maybe I can add something because I agree that the Russian propaganda really was effective before the occupation, and we all understand why, because it was a simple thing, and it was like a binary opposition, and this propaganda, the situation in Ukraine, our economy was not so brilliant and stuff like that. People in Crimean Peninsula expected fast and good results, but we can see 10 years, and we can hear their critical voices about the reality. Even then, I traced the memory of the policy poll and looked at the comments. It's a critic. It's a critic of this commemoration because of a lack of monies, a lack of new projects, very unattractive sightseeings, a lot of narrative around all that was, but really it's a Soviet infrastructure, and a lot of money spent for enough. And people understand it, even in this level. And if we are talking about 10 years of the occupation, it's also something about economy. Is it improvements or no in Crimea? Or many people can see the corruption system of Russia and oligarchs and others. And maybe it's also the point in which Ukraine can rely in our new messages, because 10 years is for the long period, and people can compare the situation in Ukraine before and situation in Russia. And my second point will be about, if we are looking on the Crimean Peninsula now on the level of the culture, museums, commemorative practice and stuff like that, it's a closed society, closed on Russia side, and also it's it's a closed territory because nobody can travel free and stuff like that. And it's also not a comfortable situation, especially for young people. And you can think in the way, oh, I'm a pioneer, I'm a defender of the Soviet Union, great Soviet Union, great Russia, heritage and stuff, but what it brings to you? And Ukraine can offer this message also about open world and new, I cannot say privilege, but new opportunities. If we compare the big but very close and very old style world of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, this is last question. I'm sorry because we absolutely talked about that. So, and I'm sorry because of this. And
I have just a practical question. Came up with this idea now when listening to you. I'd like to know what you all think about it. If on official channels they start call Crimea Kyiv in Crimean Tatar way, will it be more confusing to foreign affairs ministers, more violating Ukrainians' rights, or it will help build an anti-colonial narrative, which will help in the future? What do you think, just shortly?
Anti-colonial discourse, it's not only about Crimean Tatars, it's about Crimean Peninsula in whole. Yeah, I have to say, we can use this approach in order to build the common narrative for Ukrainian history. For instance, as for my idea, it's very relevant for Crimean Tatars, but not only for Crimean Tatars. All the peninsula, it's like a project of colonized territory.
Very shortly, before annexation, actually kind of Ukrainian narratives about Crimea is land of all people who live there. So it was not distinct really, and maybe not enough distinct with Kyiv status.
Like Yugoslavia.
Yeah, it's kind of not very well working concept after annexation, of course. And probably, I suppose, on political level, there is not enough even ability of Ukraine to raise, knowledge. What does it mean, Kyiv? So I mean, it requires long educational process. But I mean, on the cultural, academic, etc., level, it will go. And now we can see even the Crimean platform, it's already brings question of Crimean Tatars as one of the main elements, not exclusive, but really significant. And of course, in the discourse of this anti-colonial, let's say, or colonial, of course, question of Crimean Tatars is really one of the main.
I think it's a great idea, and what makes it great is that it is asymmetrical, and as you could see, I'm quite critical about this kind of reactive kind of responsiveness, doing symmetrically, tit for tat, we need to do more, we need to be asymmetrical, and it kind of asymmetrically cuts off this Russian narrative of the Russian Crimea, the eternally Russian Crimea, right? So I think it's great. It brings in the entire post-colonial or anti-colonial perspective, but it will definitely require some way to kind of shortly introduce it, connect it with the old or parallel name of Crimea, right? But it's not something that can't be done. We have seen countries like Turkey, or the Czech Republic changing names, And, right, yes. And I mean, India basically branded itself as Bharat, I think.
Bharat, yes.
Bharat, yes, on a recent summit. So, I mean, it's possible it can actually make headlines, right? So there are smart ways to do that. So I think it's a really bright idea, and we should definitely do that. But it needs to be done, in a smart way, technically, to tie in with the name of Crimea.